Hey everybody, welcome. We will give it a couple moments while we let everybody join us. I'm very excited to have you here today, and just sit tight. We'll get started in a moment. Okay, we're a couple minutes past 2, so we will go ahead and get started. So first of all, welcome everybody to day 2 of NACCED's summer meeting. Moving forward together is the theme of our education content this week. So my name is Laura DiMaria, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Association for County, Community, and Economic Development based in Washington, D.C. So NACCED, which is our acronym, we represent local governments, and we're a resource for affordable housing and community development professionals all across the country. So we're very glad that you are with us today, and extend a special welcome to newcomers to NACCED, first-time attendees, those who are meeting us for the first time. So thanks for being with us today. And if you want to know a little bit more about NACCED, you can find us online at nacced.org, which is NACCED.org, and follow us on Twitter and Facebook at NACCED News, NACCED News. And certainly as the program goes on today, if you have any thoughts or sort of feedback and questions and things, feel free to tweet us at NACCED News. So we're continuing again the summer meeting that we're holding for you here today this week called Moving Forward Together. So we put this program together designed to be a place where some of the best speakers and thinkers in community development and affordable housing can come together and discuss the state of things in 2020, what we've been through, and how we're going to proactively move forward. So this week we're talking health and housing and eviction prevention, especially today, economic recovery, and more in this very unique year that we are living through. So today the format is, since we're using the webinar function, that means that everybody who is attending is in listen-only mode, and there will be time for Q&A at the end, but feel free at any point during the presentation to put your questions in the chat box. And this is also being recorded if you want to reference it later or share it with your colleagues. So today I'm very excited to introduce to you our speaker, Diane Yentel. So Diane's talk for us today is called Ensuring Housing Stability During and After COVID-19. And so many of you probably already know Diane. She's a very well-known housing advocate. She's been a speaker at NACCED's conference in the past, as well as a guest on our podcast, The Holistic Housing Show. So she's the president and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, which is a membership-based organization dedicated solely to achieving socially just public policy that ensures people with the lowest incomes in the United States have affordable and decent homes. So please join me in welcoming Diane. And Diane, the floor is all yours.
Great, thanks, Laura. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate all of you who have joined today. I know there's a number of events that are happening at the same time, so I really appreciate those of you who were able to make time for this conversation today. And can we bring up my slides, please? Great. Okay, so to talk about the housing crisis that exists now during COVID-19, I think we have to take a step back first and recognize that even before COVID-19, we had a homelessness and housing crisis in our country. And before COVID-19, we had over 550,000 people experiencing homelessness. And those numbers were increasing for the past 3 years. And of course, the primary reason for homelessness is rising housing costs, and for the lowest income people, stagnant wages. And even before COVID-19, we had a shortage of 7 million homes affordable and available to the lowest income people. So another way of saying that same number is for every 10 of the lowest income renters, there were fewer than 4 homes affordable and available to them. And you can see from this map, this slide, that the shortage ranges from most severe to least severe, but there is no place in the country that has a sufficient number of homes affordable to the lowest income renters. Next slide, please. So because of this shortage, rents are far out of reach for low-income renters. The national average for a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, which are those bottom 2 red lines on your screen, is more than what the average renter earns. And it's far more than what a person living in poverty has to pay for the rent. So even before COVID-19, because of this shortage of homes affordable for the lowest income people, because of this gap between what people earn and what rent costs, we had nearly 8 million of the lowest income renter households, so about 25 million people in these households, that were paying at least 50% of their income towards rent. And many were paying much more, 60, 70, 80% of their income for rent. So when you have such limited income to begin with, and you're paying so much of it to keep a roof over your head, you are always one financial emergency, one financial shock away from missing rent and potentially being evicted, and in worst cases, facing homelessness. Next slide, please. So for many of these same renters, the coronavirus is that financial shock. They are losing jobs at a shocking level. They're losing hours at work. They're losing wages, and it's harder than ever for them to cobble together what's needed to make rent. So our estimate, our conservative estimate, is that the financial fallout from COVID-19 will increase the number of extremely low income or very low income renters by at least 1.5 million households. So now they too are competing for those very limited number of homes and apartments that are affordable to them. Next slide, please. And it's important to recognize that the job losses, just like every other aspect of COVID-19, is not being felt equally. Black people and Latinos are losing jobs faster than white workers. Next slide, please. So if we had a system in our country to catch people when they fall off of a financial cliff created by any disaster, but especially one like COVID-19, then we'd be able to better weather these challenges. But we don't have such a system. Instead, we have a system in our country where just 1 in every 4 households that is in need of housing assistance and eligible for it receives any. So 75% of people eligible for housing assistance, in need of housing assistance, receive none. They are the folks who are standing in line, adding their names to years or sometimes decades-long waiting lists, hoping to win what is a housing lottery, which is the system that we have in our country. So now, because of all of this, we're facing some just tremendously challenging scenarios. Like, what happens when people who are sleeping in encampments, in tents on sidewalks, have no access to hot water or soap in the middle of a pandemic? What happens when millions of people are on the cusp of losing their homes in the middle of a public health emergency, when our collective health depends on our ability to stay home? If nothing else, I think this pandemic really drives home the truth that housing is healthcare, and that we will not truly contain this pandemic as long as hundreds of thousands of people remain unhoused and unsheltered, and especially if we allow millions more families to become homeless. Next slide, please. And while the current crises have heightened the threat of eviction for Black and brown renters, it's not new, right? Decades of racist housing policies, redlining, blockbusting, restrictive covenants, restrictive zoning, has purposefully put homeownership out of reach for Black families, which created a yawning generational wealth gap, where today the average white family holds 12 times as much wealth as the average Black family. And this has created tremendous racial disparities in housing and in homelessness. So structural racism leaves people of color disproportionately low income, disproportionately rent burdened, disproportionately likely to experience homelessness. So for example, Black people are about 13% of the general population. They make up 40% of people experiencing homelessness, and they are 50% of homeless families with children. So these inequities now compound the harm done by COVID-19. Black and Native Americans are bearing the brunt of the infections and the fatalities, and Latino and Black people are bearing the brunt of these historic job losses, and now their homes, and with it their families' ability to stay safe and healthy, are at risk. So these facts, this moment of seeing what structural racism is and what it means, I think it heightens both the urgency for action, right? Without significant federal intervention, millions of low-income renters and predominantly Black and brown renters will be evicted from their homes in the coming months. And it also makes clear our obligation to center racial equity in our response to the housing needs of COVID-19. We have to ensure that not only do we not worsen or reinforce racial inequities, but we have to utilize these new housing and homelessness dollars to reverse and correct these racial disparities. Next slide, please. So the solutions to all of this are pretty simple, even if they're not easy, right? We have to protect, keep alive, and house people who are experiencing homelessness. We have to prevent any more people from becoming homeless, and we have to center racial equity in the work. Next slide, please. So the CARES Act was a good start, right? We have in the CARES Act $4 billion in emergency solutions grants to help homeless shelter providers and service providers both have access to resources to keep themselves and their clients safe and healthy, and also to implement social distancing to get people into housing as soon as possible. Next slide, please. There was also, of course, you all know and are utilizing $5 billion in CDBG funds, which among other things can be used for emergency rental assistance. Next slide, please. And there was other funding for HUD subsidized tenants. There was the $150 billion in coronavirus relief funds, which I'll talk about in a moment, and some limited eviction and foreclosure moratoriums. So these limited federal eviction moratoriums were a really important step forward. They protect about 30% of renters nationally from eviction for the moment. But it's been a very complicated process, both to enforce these protections and even for renters to know whether or not they are covered. Because the protections, these limited federal eviction moratoriums apply only to low-income renters who live in subsidized housing, like public housing, vouchers, low-income housing tax credits, and so on, or who live in multifamily properties where the mortgage is backed by Fannie or Freddie. So it's very difficult for a renter to know if they live in a building where the mortgage is backed by Fannie or Freddie. Sometimes the owner of that building doesn't know that information themselves. So we created a database that you can find on our website, a searchable database where renters can go and type in their apartment and learn whether or not they are covered by this federal eviction moratorium. We pulled public data from Fannie, Freddie, HUD, USDA, and other sources and put it into this one searchable database. Even that, though, is not comprehensive. There are small rental properties, including single-family rental properties, that are not included in that database because those data are not public. But it's a place where people can go to learn if they are covered by this protection. Next slide, please. And in addition to the federal eviction moratorium, of course, there has also been put in place a patchwork of state and local eviction moratoriums that protected still more renters. And with the funds made available through the CARES Act, many of you are putting these to good use now, using the CDBG-CV or the ESG-CV. In some cases, you're using the coronavirus relief funds to create emergency rental assistance programs, which is so essential. We've been tracking, at the National Income Housing Coalition, we have been tracking all of the emergency rental assistance programs that have been created over the last 2 to 3 months. And so far, there are about 151 of these programs created around the country. There are some issues and some challenges with all of these programs, but the primary one that they all have in common is limited resources. So we are seeing, and many of you may be from these communities, where rental assistance programs are having to shut down within hours or days as the demand just overwhelms the resources. So throughout the country, the demand for emergency rental assistance is far outstripping available resources. And now we are reaching eviction moratorium deadlines. So as of this week, 30 governors have allowed their eviction moratoriums to expire, and the federal eviction moratorium expires next week. And I do want to say both I just want to share that the urgency of that is very real, and that the CARES Act does have an additional 30-day buffer for low-income renters who are protected by the federal eviction moratorium. So the moratorium itself expires on July 24th, but it requires then that landlords give a 30-day notice before they evict. So there's still some time to act to prevent these massive evictions that we are expecting if no action is taken. Next slide, please. So much more is needed. Clearly, we need, as we have been saying from the beginning, there should be at least $11.5 billion in emergency solutions grants in addition to the funds that have already been appropriated. This is based on research about what it will cost to keep all people currently experiencing homelessness safe and alive and ideally housed during the pandemic. We also need a national uniform moratorium on evictions and foreclosures for the duration of the pandemic. The very least the federal government ought to do during a global pandemic is ensure each of us that we won't lose our homes in the midst of it. And from the beginning, we have said that moratoriums on their own aren't enough, that what moratoriums do is create a moment of relief and protection. They also create a financial cliff for renters to fall off of when those moratoriums are lifted and back rent is owed. And so it's essential that the federal government also provide adequate emergency rental assistance. At least $100 billion is needed. Next slide, please. So $100 billion is not a random number. It is what we estimate, and many other research institutions have also made a similar estimate, whether it's the Urban Institute or Harvard's Joint Center on Housing Studies and others, all similarly estimate that we need about and at least $100 billion in order to keep low-income renters stably housed during and after the pandemic. Next slide, please. So there has been legislation to do just that, to provide $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. In the House, it was introduced by Chairwoman Maxine Waters and Representative Denny Heck. In the House, it has now about 157 co-sponsors. In the Senate, it was introduced by Senator Sherrod Brown and has 40 Senate co-sponsors. The House, at this point, has passed these emergency protections, both a uniform moratorium on evictions and $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. The House has passed that not just once, but twice. through the HEROES Act and through a standalone bill that pulled together the essential housing components from the HEROES Act. The Senate has not yet acted. Next step, please. Next slide, please. And it's essential that they do. And so I hope that if you do any one thing after this webinar and after this conversation, I hope that it is that you reach out to your member of Congress, even if you've already reached out to them, and especially if you haven't yet, to urge action. This slide talks about the Emergency Rental Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act, which is the $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. You should urge your member of Congress to co-sponsor the bills that are active at this moment for both, and also urge that these and the other protections that I talked about be included in a final relief package. We are down to the wire here. The Senate is going to pass a spending bill, and they'll do it sometime in the next 3 to 4 weeks. And what is in that spending bill, and whether and how it actually addresses the immediate housing needs of low-income people across the country, is still very much an open question. Next slide, please. And the stakes right now could not be higher. We know with certainty that without a significant federal intervention, there will be a wave of evictions and a spike in homelessness throughout the country. And in fact, in many ways, that wave has already begun. Evictions are occurring in states where the moratoriums have lifted. And so our work now is to prevent it from becoming a tsunami. And we are running out of time. We are now seeing this very horrifying, frankly, confluence of increasing evictions in states and cities where new coronavirus cases are surging. And every day of inaction is putting more low-income people, seniors, people with disabilities, families with children, and others at immediate risk of losing their homes. Congress has to act with urgency to keep people in their homes, keep unhoused people alive, get people experiencing homelessness quickly housed. And it's essential, right? Ensuring that everybody is stably housed during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. It's not just a moral imperative, but very clearly it is a public health necessity. Next slide, please. And I want to end with, I want to leave you, before we open it up for questions and conversation, with this image that I think about often. This picture is from Las Vegas from a couple of months ago. There was a local homeless shelter that had to close its doors after an employee became infected with COVID-19. And in response, the city moved all the people that had been sleeping in the shelter onto open air concrete slabs, carefully placed 6 feet apart. And these people, our neighbors experiencing homelessness, this is in Las Vegas. So they slept in the shadow of dozens of completely empty hotel buildings. And I think about this often, and I share it with all of you because it encapsulates so many things. It encapsulates how our country's ongoing failure to respond in any meaningful way to homelessness, about the cruel and often dehumanizing way that some communities treat people experiencing homelessness, and about the work that we have to do towards long-term solutions. Because to end where I started, the immediate housing crisis, this eviction tsunami that we are working to prevent, it sits atop a long-standing and pervasive shortage of affordable homes throughout the country, right? We had an affordable housing crisis before COVID-19. It's exacerbated now. We will have that same affordable housing crisis after COVID-19. Unless we're willing as a country to make the kind of substantial, sustained investments needed in long-term solutions to end homelessness and housing poverty, then we'll just face this eviction and homelessness crisis again during the next pandemic, during the next wave of this pandemic, during the next natural disaster, or even just in the next year, because we will still not have solved for the underlying shortage of homes affordable and available to the lowest income people. And the long-term solutions are also simple, even if they're not easy, right? We need significant and sustained funding to build apartments affordable to the lowest income people through the National Housing Trust Fund. We need to remove restrictive zoning that exacerbates racial disparities and prevents often any type of apartment from being built, much less affordable apartments, driving up costs for everybody. We need to bridge the gap between what people earn and what rent costs, and we do that through rental assistance programs like Section 8 vouchers. And we need a long-term emergency cash assistance and eviction prevention program. And certainly we need to preserve our country's existing public housing and other affordable housing stock. Allowing homelessness and housing poverty to exist in our country has always been simply a public policy choice. And we can choose instead to end it. Certainly we have the data, we have the solutions. As a country, we have the resources. The only thing we've always lacked is the political will to fund the solutions at the scale necessary. And perhaps this moment helps us build that political will to achieve change. So Laura, thanks again for the opportunity to be here and discuss this important topic, and I look forward to any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Diane. So as I put in the chat, if you have a question, just pop it over there. I've got a couple to get us started. So as you know, NACCED's members are all local governments. We have many local government professionals here on the call. So what can local governments, like where should they start to address all of this, especially in the areas where maybe the eviction moratorium is already up?
Well, I mean, the first thing, like local governments have in some ways a tremendous amount of control and power here. And where eviction moratoriums have been allowed to expire, they should be implemented again. And especially in places where we are seeing a surge of coronavirus cases happening, but really throughout the country, because it's clear that whether this is a worsening of the first phase of the pandemic or the second stage of the pandemic, in either case, we are still in the thick of it, and we need to keep people housed. So the very first thing that city governments and state governments should do is implement eviction moratoriums, keep people in their homes. Hopefully the federal government will act, but it doesn't require the federal government to keep people in your city or your county or your state stably housed. Then emergency rental assistance is essential. And I know that many of you have been creating emergency rental assistance programs. And I'd say a few things about them. I think, as I said earlier, the biggest challenge here, right, is that it's not enough resources, and I certainly recognize that. And I think because of that, we're always, unfortunately, in a space of limited resources. And I think especially now, it's essential that those resources be targeted towards those with the greatest and the most immediate needs. So there are places where the income targeting for some of these rental assistance programs goes pretty high, when the need among the lowest income renters is severe and urgent. So I would encourage people to target the funds towards the lowest income people, to focus emergency ESG funds on people who are literally homeless now. So in some ways, prevention can be appealing because we're preventing homelessness, of course, and because in many ways it's easier than actually getting somebody who's sleeping in an encampment or in a shelter into a permanent home. But those ESG funds, it's a significant amount of money, and it's an opportunity for localities to actually re-envision their homeless shelter systems to get people quickly into housing, and to use those resources to get people experiencing homelessness housed. And both of those, I would just reiterate, that doing that, targeting your resources towards the lowest income renters, targeting resources towards people experiencing homelessness, in doing that, you are centering racial equity in the work in many ways. Because we know that people experiencing homelessness are disproportionately Black people, and in some cases Latino and Native people. And we know that extremely low income renters are disproportionately people of color. So just starting with targeting your resources in that manner help you start the work of centering racial equity in the solutions. And then other considerations I think are very important too, like who's being left out altogether, and those are the most vulnerable people, right? And I am talking mostly about undocumented immigrants. Undocumented immigrants are not getting any assistance from the federal government at all. They're not getting unemployment insurance. They are not getting stimulus checks, and they are hurting and very close to spilling into homelessness. And so one of the benefits of some of these federal funds, actually the housing dollars, is that localities can use some of these funds to serve undocumented renters, to keep them stably housed. And I would urge people to do that as well. I'd also just say one more thing, Laura, we joined together with the National Alliance to End Homelessness, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, National Innovation Services, Urban Institute, and National Healthcare for the Homeless Council to create a framework for how to start making these decisions. And you can go to any of our websites, go to the National Alliance to End Homelessness first, and just search for the framework, and you'll find it there. And it's meant to answer exactly this question and to help all of you who have these tremendous challenges, some overwhelming level of resources and rules for each resources, and pretty extraordinary opportunity right now to help guide you through the whole process. So I really encourage people to take a look at that framework.
Thank you. And we have a question that came in on the chat. So if you have any insight into this, is there any effort to get the Coronavirus Relief Fund extended beyond December 30th in Congress? Do you know?
I know that that's something that's come up often. That's something that we were initially waiting to see if Treasury was willing to address. And we've had some indications from them that they may be willing to extend some of those timelines. But the statutory ones, of course, need to be addressed by Congress. And I can't say that I'm aware of any conversations right now to do that.
On a similar note, we have all been wondering, as I mentioned to you, when the last bit of CDBG-CV is supposed to come out. And that's the bit that has been described as being allocated at the Secretary's discretion. So do you have any insight into that?
So my understanding on that has been very delayed, along with the guidance for how communities can use the CDBG-CV funds, the notice, along with the notice for ESG-CV funds too. And unfortunately, I don't have a good answer there. I only have what HUD has been saying every week for the last 2 months, which is that it's coming any day. I do know that it has moved through the system a little bit, and it could literally come any day. Or it can continue to be delayed for some really unknown reasons. We keep pushing HUD, and members of Congress too are now getting concerned about how long it's taking HUD to get this money out and get the guidance out, and so they're starting to push as well. And maybe if they haven't before this final bill is passed, we might see some legislative language requiring them to act faster.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's a big mystery. All right, another question. Are there key members of Congress that you'd recommend NACCED as an organization, but particularly our members, individuals throughout the country, to reach out to certain members of Congress?
Yes, thank you for that question. So there's two things that we need to do right now. One is we need to make sure Democrats aren't going to get everything they want in this next spending bill, right? They can't, just the nature of politics. And so Democrats have a long list of what they want to see in this next spending package. And we need to make sure that they keep the housing and needs of the lowest income people at the very top of that priority list. So we have been pushing Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, to be sure that they continue to prioritize it. So far they are. And they've been on a couple national calls that we've had to say how essential they view these policy provisions and how much they are committed to keeping them at the top of the priority list. We also need the rest of the Democrats to continue to have this be a top priority for them as well. And one of the ways we do that is by looking at who has already and who hasn't co-sponsored the Emergency Rental Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act. That's the $100 billion. So in the House right now, there are only a handful of Democrats who have not co-sponsored that legislation, and we need them to. And that includes Senator Maria Cantwell from Washington, Senator Warner from Virginia, Senator Carper from Delaware, Senator Angus King from Maine. So we should continue to push each of them. Why aren't they on this bill? It's the easiest thing to co-sponsor this bill. And if they're not going to co-sponsor it, then what is their solution? How are they going to prevent this wave of evictions? And how are they going to get people who are experiencing homelessness housed? So that's on the Democratic side. And we've got some tremendous champions in the House and in the Senate that are really pushing to get this done. Then the Democrats can't get it done on their own either. And there has to be Republican support for this. So on the Republican side, some of the key targets are one, Senator Crapo from Idaho, who I think I said, did I say Senator Crapo before? I meant to say Senator Carper from Delaware. So on the Republican side, Senator Crapo from Idaho, he is the chair of the Housing and Banking Committee. He's essential in the negotiations. He's been somewhat supportive of housing in the past, so we need him to prioritize this. Also, Senator Collins from Maine. And then other senators who either have talked about the need for rental assistance or in the past have been supportive of housing in some manner. And that includes Senator Todd Young from Indiana, Senator Rob Portman from Ohio, and Senator McSally from Arizona. So those are our top targets. So definitely reach out to each of them and urge that these priorities be included in a final bill, but also reach out to whoever your member of Congress is and either thank them for what they've done already, tell them you're watching, urge them to prioritize this in final negotiations, or if they're not supporting it, ask them why and demand to know what their solution is. And I'll just say here too, while I have a chance, is that as I said earlier, there's going to be a bill. There's going to be another spending bill here. And the Democrats and the Republicans have to work together. Democrats have been prioritizing rental assistance. Republicans are not publicly, but they are talking about it amongst themselves. They are starting to talk about it with their leadership in the Senate. Republicans recognize that they need to do something to prevent this wave of evictions in their state too. And so now we're in a better position of actually starting to talk about, well, what does that rental assistance look like and who benefits from it and what's the size and what's the scope. So we are making progress in this push, but we have much further to go and very little time to get there.
Yeah, agreed about the time for sure. So someone's wanting you to repeat the bill number.
Oh, the bill number? I actually, great question. I don't have that in front of me.
Okay. David, we'll find out and I'll include that in the afterwards materials.
Yeah, it's in my slide. I just don't have it in front of me.
Okay, yeah, easy. All right, let me see. Again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and let me look through some of mine here. So in terms of the federal eviction moratorium in stating that, because with it expiring, what do you think the chances of that happening are?
Of continuing it?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a really hard one to guess, because I know that there are many apartment associations who oppose the eviction moratoriums that exist now and certainly oppose extending them. There are many Republicans who are also opposed to extending the moratorium. There's been this very unfortunate sort of conflation of the need for an emergency rental assistance to go with eviction moratoriums has always been clear. But sometimes Republicans and apartment associations suggest that if there is an eviction moratorium, renters who can pay their rent won't, because they'll just see it as like a rent vacation. And there's, from day one until now, there's zero evidence of that. Literally, there's no data to suggest that that is actually happening. And so it's hard to say, because there are a number of states, there's about a handful of states now where landlord associations are suing the governor to oppose the state eviction moratorium, and they're also certainly talking to their members of Congress. At the same time, there's no doubt that the eviction moratorium, as limited as it was and as difficult to enforce as it was, it's kept people housed. And again, I think people really recognize that what is going to happen, especially when this eviction moratorium expires at the same time that expanded unemployment insurance is going to expire. So I think there will be, in the end, I think we will be able to achieve some extension of it. I just don't know how comprehensive it will be or how long we'll be able to extend it for.
Yeah, definitely. I think those combined factors of unemployment running out, you know, it's almost like we haven't really seen the full effects of everything yet. You know,
Yeah.
we're kind of running on fumes a little bit, and there's more to come, certainly. Well, I want to, if we don't have any questions coming in, one thing I'd like to end with, because we hear a lot about this right now, is around racial equity, particularly in housing. And so you're advocating to center racial equity in the work of housing. So can you tell us a little bit more about that, aside from kind of just identifying who has been left out, you know, or talking about things like redlining? How can we do this in a proactive way? And particularly, how can local governments do this?
Yeah, it's big work, right? We are talking about decades, centuries really, of policies, racist housing, transportation, wealth policies that created the disparities that we have today. So it's not something that can be, undoing those disparities can't happen quickly. But there are so many things that all of us can be doing every day to better center racial equity and ultimately work towards achieving racial justice. And it starts with the work of being anti-racist. I don't know if you or others have heard of or read Dr. Ibram Kendi's work, but I highly recommend that you do. That is a very good and important place for people to start to understand what it means to advance anti-racist policies. And I don't want to try to paraphrase a very brilliant person, but essentially it means that if the policies that we are advancing or implementing aren't actively anti-racist, they have a racist effect, because so much of our policy and so much of our culture has racial disparities baked into it. And so we have to be very deliberate about every policy that we implement, every policy that we advance is actively anti-racist and undoing structural inequities. We also do the work in much more simple and immediate ways, like I talked about earlier, in targeting resources towards the lowest income and most historically marginalized people. When we are housing predominantly Black and Native homeless people, we are working towards racial justice and racial equity. When we create rental assistance programs that target the lowest income renters, we are disproportionately helping people of color. When we target rental assistance programs that help high income renters, we are exacerbating racial inequities. So we have to look at the data and see what it tells us and target resources towards those who have been marginalized for the longest. And then finally, we have to look at who's making the decisions and who holds the power to both create the policies and implement the policies. And if it's not at the least inclusive of people of color, and at the best led by people of color, then we won't actually achieve the racial equities or racial justice that we need to. So we need to really examine ourselves, our own leadership, our organizations, and certainly all of the decision-making tables that we sit at to see who's there, and mostly to recognize who's not, and actively work to bring them into positions of power.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like we've got our work cut out on a couple different fronts. It's great to have you with us as always. So thank you for your presentation today. Last call for any questions or anything. Thank you for all the information. And yes, we'll share the slides and all the information today, including that bill number. So yeah, so thank you everyone for being with us on today's call, and Diane for sharing that great information. If you enjoyed today's talk and want to share what you learned, please tweet at us at NACCED News. And we hope that you'll join us again tomorrow for the last day of our summer meeting. Same time, same place. We'll be joined by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities Vice President for Housing Policy, Peggy Bailey. And she is going to be giving us a talk sort of building on this theme of racial equity in housing called COVID-19 and the intersection of health and housing now and in the future. So Diane, thank you once again. Stay well. We will be in touch, and good luck with everything.
Great. Thanks so much, Laura.
All right. Thank you, everyone.